Yes. Thank you very much for joining us for this session, this discussion about a wonderful book with Reinier de Graaf. Коллеги, мы будем говорить на английском языке, поэтому если вам понадобится...
Ladies and gentlemen, our discussion will be held mostly in English, so if you need interpretation, please get yourself a headset.
I'm an architect and educator working between London and Moscow. And it's my great pleasure and a great honor to have with us Reinier de Graaf today, the author of a wonderful book, Four Walls and a Roof, The Complex Nature of a Simple Profession, an architect, an urbanist, a partner at OMA, a researcher, an educator, and a great, I think, wit and critic of our profession and of our time. So it's a great honor to have you, Reinier. Welcome. And
thank you.
It's our great pleasure to present and discuss Reinier's book today. We'll have a conversation of about 30 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity for a discussion. So please prepare your questions, and you can ask Reinier, and hopefully we'll have a discussion with the audience. So I wanted to begin actually with a sort of history jump back. Your book, Four Walls and a Roof, I think it was originally going to be called The Century That Never Happened. What do you mean by this phrase, and how does it relate to your practice, Reinier?
The book is a repository of the 20th century and the developments that existed in architecture at the time, and it talks about how all of these developments have continued to exist in the 21st century, but that somehow they play a completely different socio-economic role in the 21st century than they did in the 20th century, and also a very different role from what they were intended for. Maybe I should say something about the cover.
Yes, please.
In this respect. So the house on this cover, which is a very simple house, which could have been built last year, could have been built 50 years ago, could have been built 200 years ago, is actually a house which completely exists of recycled panels of a communist housing estate in the former DDR, which has been demolished, of which the facade panels, the floor elements, etc., have been taken apart, moved and reconfigured to form this house, concealed by a thick layer of stucco and crowned by a pitched roof. So for me, the paradox of this house is that in some way it's extremely modern, in the sense that its ingredients are all very modern, very socialist even, while the house itself almost looks like the 20th century never happened. This could have been a late 19th century house. So the house is at the same time the embodiment of all that is modern, while its physical suggestion is as though modernity never happened. And in a way, so the house is a presence and a form of erasure. And that is the theme of most of the essays in the book of sorts.
And it's a kind of hyper-normalization, in a way.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can that.
I mean this photograph in particular.
The term normal is a very interesting one, of course, because normalization is the term that the Germans apply to the demolition of former communist housing estates. They demolish them from being 11 stories to 4 stories, because when they're 4 stories, they are normal. And when they're apparently 11 stories, they are abnormal, which for me is a very, very crucial term in a way. I guess one could call this house normal and abnormal at the same time. I think there's a very curious thing that one could say that maybe the 20th century was an era in which there was a radical pursuit of normal conditions for everyone. Where there was, in a way, a radical pursuit of the mundane. And in the 21st century, you see an interesting reversal and a trend in architecture where you could almost say that there is a very mundane pursuit of the radical. And that while we see very, very many buildings being built in the name of the iconic, in the name of the acceptable, that the one-time purpose of modern architecture, which in a way was normal, affordable conditions for everyone, is being put increasingly on the back burner. So in that sense, the message of the normal is already very doubly edged.
Mm-hmm. And you write in this book about your personal experience of growing up on a mass housing estate. Do you think that this house, this individual bungalow, presents a better quality of life than the mass housing estates? Or can a new approach to building social housing on a mass scale provide and improve a quality of life for contemporary cities? Or should we be measuring quality of life by other means entirely?
I don't think it does. I mean, this is a suburban house, you know, which can only ever, this is a holiday bungalow, so I don't think this is a paradigm for the way forward, and I don't think this is better or worse than any of the housing estates it replaces. I mean, the ultimate urban consequence of a house like this is sprawl, endless waste of space, endless infrastructure. So I don't think it's the way forward. The irony is that this is a house in Wusterwirtz, which is in the former GDR in Brandenburg. And it is a sort of suburban estate in which there is the Karl Marx Strasse, there is the August Babel Strasse, there is the Karl Liebknecht Strasse. So it celebrates its former communist heroes in the form of street names. But in terms of morphology, I guess this could have been the average American suburb just as much as it is here. I don't think this is a viable proposition for social housing in the face of an increasingly large number of people that are in need of that.
No, absolutely. Well, if we go back to a larger scale and a higher density, which is what most cities are building, most governments are procuring to tackle the housing crisis, which this city is also experiencing. Can you see a real opportunity for the improvement of quality of life in contemporary cities for people through a drive in social housing, public and private partnership? Or should we be looking at other amenities, other ways of measuring the quality of the public realm and livable cities?
It's an interesting question, because the notion quality of life is very much linked to the notion of the livable city. But the notion of the livable city is generally composed of a series of criteria which are there for expat packages. The criteria we call livability criteria are almost exclusively economic criteria, and I don't think that is per se a viable way forward, because the economy thrives when real estate gets more and more expensive. I mean, that is a driver for economic growth. But when real estate gets more and more expensive, when buildings get more and more expensive, it becomes harder for the vast majority of people to afford a home. So in a lot of Western capitals, at least, we have the paradoxical situation that on paper we seem to be economically thriving, and there is an ever larger quantity of people that look around them and just see it harder and harder for them to afford normal things. And there is again the double edge of the word normal. I think we are living through an age where through the excessive emphasis on the economic value of architecture, the normal, what used to be the normal, is slowly becoming an exceptional, the abnormal and an exceptionally hard to reach condition, which was also, of course, the content of, I guess, what I tried to say in that unfortunate presentation I had to give on the panel this morning.
And if we talk about alternative ways of measuring development and quality of life and the livability of cities, what would you say are the most important amenities? And can you bring any examples of cities that are that have a high quality of life and cities that perhaps score lower on the quality of life for you personally?
For me personally, I mean, the real measure of the quality of life is related to a fair and equal distribution of means, which housing is by and large part. I think a large number, when it's shared by very few people, is meaningless as a large number. So for me, the prime driver for a quality of life in a city is the smallness of income disparity. It is not about the sum total of the wealth. It is about the distribution of wealth amongst as many people as possible. For me, a city is ultimately driven by the participation of as many people as possible in that city. And I think by definition that will generate a nicer city, it will generate nicer physical experience, it will generate public space, it will generate better, all of that when it's the case. I think the problem in a lot of discussions like this, in a lot of discussion on architectural forum, is that we think that a good public space generates a fair society. It is the other way around. A fair society generates a good public space. Things like participation, public space, the community, all these terms only entered the discourse once they became a problem. And in my view, there is a real economic reason why these things became a problem. And the more we talk about public space, the less we talk about the underlying cause why public space is problematic, which has, in the end, very little to do with design. I think there is probably a zillion ways at which you can make an agreeable public space. The most important factor of a public space is the happiness and the well-being of the people that are in that public space.
Economics and governance.
Well, I mean, inasmuch as government controls the happiness of individuals, which are.
And are these themes touched upon?
Inasmuch as a government controls the well-being of individuals, that of course inevitably has an economic side, because the government doesn't interfere in everything. The government doesn't interfere in your love life, at least not yet. It's essentially the managing of public resources, money, and economics that is under the responsibilities of the public sector, and that is actually where they can help.
And are these questions covered in the research and the work that you're doing at Cambridge University with students?
Yeah. Well, they're also essentially covered in this book. I mean, the research I'm doing in Cambridge is a direct extension of the book. I think the weird paradox is that there is physical evidence, as you can see, of the existence of the book, while the book is conspicuously absent at this conference. For reasons I cannot exactly fathom, but the book does exist. It's been translated. It has a chapter on public space. It has a chapter on the economy, and it has a chapter called "The Century That Never Happened," which essentially encapsulates many of the things we are speaking about. The research program I run in Cambridge is a further investigation of the economics of architecture. architecture, and particularly what could be done to create a more favorable economic system towards architecture and ultimately quality of life. So if this book in a way poses the question very emphatically, the research program we are doing there is about strategies to deal with that, and how much these strategies can be provided by architecture alone, or whether they need a broader coalition between various academic sector, and I think the latter.
There is a chapter in the book where you deconstruct what you call the box, and you also talk about the machine box, and you talk about beauty, and that when the architect is trying to provide a project with beauty, or trying to provide the world with some beauty through their architecture, that we, the architects, are living on borrowed time because we're trapped in a losing battle between the financial model and the client. Is it time to urgently redefine the profession, and how do we do it?
I'm not sure if I would put it like that. I think it is very urgent because if you redefine the profession, then you're again myopically self-obsessed. I think it is time for the profession not to redefine itself, but to look outside the profession as to what is happening in the world around, which will probably provide very compelling reasons to do a number of things differently, or to think twice before doing certain things, etc. But I don't think it's about redefining the profession. My book is a very aggressive plea for a greater interest in the context in which architecture is produced. And then I don't mean just the physical context, but the societal and mainly the economic context in which it is produced. Because I think, strangely, architects are hugely aware of how to make cost cuts and make buildings cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. They're generally blissfully unaware of the real role buildings play as an asset class in the current economic system. And that is, in a way, the question the book poses. So it's a call to look outside, rather than because the profession gets redefined every 5 years, every 2 years, every week, with every new design publication, and I don't think that per se is interesting.
Mm-hmm. And buildings as an asset class, would you mind expanding on that for those who aren't aware?
Currently, there is value in the world, there is money in the world, but money is counterbalanced by physical substance, which is in a way the collateral for that money to be worth the money it is worth. That used to be a big good stock of gold in Fort Knox. That was the physical material equivalent to money. The current economic system doesn't work like that. It works with stock markets, it works with goods and services that are traded. So those can be divided into classes, and most of the value of the economic system is represented by real estate, by, in other words, buildings. That's worth more than gold, more than fossil fuel reserves, etc., etc. It is buildings. So buildings are built to create, for people to live in. Buildings are built for money to create returns. When we think of functionalism, we think of how people use buildings. When investors commission buildings, they think of ways that that building in 5 years' time is double the value that it is today. You know, we have a banking system worldwide where you get 0.00000% on your savings or on money in the bank. So money is looking for ways, either through weird startups, strange projects, but mostly money is looking for a way to create greater return in real estate. So in my view, much of the perceived shortages of housing and much of the building waves we see around in major cities, it's not so much people looking for a home, it's money looking for a home. And that is a reality that I at least never hear any architect talk about. And very often that is the main raison d'etre for buildings. You know, these ultra slim towers in New York, they don't cater to vast amounts of people. I mean, we have a 400-meter high tower, which apparently caters to 36 people, if they're even there. I mean, that is not an answer to a housing crisis. That is an answer to money looking for a way to multiply.
Mm-hmm. And money looking for a physical manifestation.
И они имеют
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And you believe that architects have an agency to use and to play in this situation?
Well, I mean, architects can do whatever the hell they want. But I would respect a person that knows what he's doing while he's doing it more than a person who does it and he doesn't even realize what he's doing and he thinks he's making an enlightened modern contribution to mankind. You know, and you can say, well, there's two ways about that. Of course, if you know what you're doing is bad, then why do you do it? Because that would in a way make it worse. But for me, that somehow makes it better. I don't know. I always the sort of knowledgeable pervert to the ignorant fool. And I guess in the current world, it's a choice between these two typologies.
Well, I think in a way, architects predominantly are now working for these hyper-commercial projects, or on the other hand, they're working for large infrastructural projects, or in fact, as AMO and OMA have done in the past on kind of hypothetical and research and prognosis projects, often not even for governments of nations, but for example, your roadmap 2050 for the client as the European Union, as the Energy Commission of the European Union. And so in a sense, new infrastructure, is that also money looking for a physical manifestation, or are these public big projects a different type of practice and a different type of looking at the future?
I think, well, I must confess that a lot of the macro infrastructure, can we have pages of the book, perhaps? Just as further demonstration of its existence. I think very big projects are by definition the domain of the public sector. And for that very reason, they escape some of the logics I've just described. But with an ever shrinking public sector, large infrastructural projects are increasingly problematic. So we found with AMO that our large-scale infrastructure project have mainly remained theoretical, not because they're implausible in terms of ideology, simply because there is no longer a large public sector to cater to large public ambitions. And so they're projects, but they're a kind of research in their own rights to potential alternatives. But I would happily include ourselves as architects also being complicit in some of the more fraudulent mechanisms I've described. So I don't think we ourselves go scot-free either. I just talk about it, and that's probably the only difference. Is it well translated?
Just nod.
Because I have no clue, I have to say.
I think I've been going too fast with the slides. I'll stop on this one. So the big projects for which we act as to highlight a problematic or to perhaps catalyze a change in approach, potentiality, a future commission in a much longer time frame. Isn't it the case that OMA, where you are a partner, was predominantly concerned with paper architecture and competitions for the first 10 to 20 years of its existence, until the world, in fact, did catch up with an outlook and interest in big?
So maybe they're a form of wishful thinking, which I'm sure they are, and sometimes wishful thinking means the thinking comes through, but there's something interesting because, I mean, to use the energy project as an example, I mean that project made the case that if Europe looked at renewable energy collectively, they could have all the energy in the world. If they had a sensible system of exchange, they could actually pass the stage of fossil fuels, et cetera, if only they collaborated sensibly. And that, of course, was presented at a moment that Europe was about to fall apart. Now, that makes the project both irrelevant and hyper-relevant. And it's often at the threshold of these two, I think, that our projects have always existed, that they were well-timed, strangely apt implausibilities. That's how I would describe the Euro project, because strangely, I think it's easier for Europe to integrate when it actually has a practical reason in the form of energy and an industrial project and an infrastructural project to look after, than when it has to engage in an endless discussion of how similar Germans are to Italians, how irresponsible Greeks are compared to Dutch people, etc. I think that's a never-ending discussion. For me also, I mean, I work in a firm in the Netherlands where 10% of the employees are Dutch. We speak English, and the rest of the employees comes from all over. And there is a very weird mechanism that work and hard work is the best possible integrator of identity possible, simply because it prevents you to talk about identity all the time. And similarly, I think the best solution to public space, the community and all that crap, is if we were to stop talking about it.
Yeah, well, we have seen how a crisis can bring people together and solve a much larger problem. Yeah. And it would be great to get a little bit more of this insider's view, because your office is multidisciplinary, it's very international, and I wanted to ask you this question about being forward-looking and being, as you said, kind of futuristic, but also on time, or perhaps just slightly late. I was wondering if you have any approaches to future-proofing your practice through diversifying or through any other means.
Yeah, I mean, the best way of future-proofing is to simply resign to the fact that anything can happen. And that is at the same time the exact antithesis of future-proofing as well. It's interesting, the last the last serious involvement I had in Russia was a studio at Strelka, which was called Foresight in Hindsight. It analyzed predictions, but it analyzed predictions from the past. So in therefore using the present as a way to take stock of whether or not predictions came through. And some did, some didn't, some the jury was still out. So in that sense, you couldn't say that mankind is particularly good or bad at predicting its own future. What was interesting there is what we had a number of domains: economics, the humanities, politics, arts, science. And what was very interesting there is that each domain was absolutely worst at predicting its own future. So you got the curious thing that economists were absolute specialists on predicting the future of art. Artists were the perfect predictors of science. Politicians were simply always wrong in a curious way. So that, in a way, made a very compelling case, not for either stopping or continuing to predict the future, but it made a very compelling case for multidisciplinarity yet again. And in that sense, I mean, OMA is an architecture office. AMO, I don't know really what it is. It's more specifically everything. And I guess that in its own right is a way of diversifying, not just in terms of types of people or ethnicities, but an attempt to diversify subject matter to the point where there is at least a certain robustness possible into seeing coming what could happen. That's as far as I would go. And we get it wrong. I mean, but the scientist and the fortune teller, they have that in common, that they both get it wrong, and we get it wrong.
Well, I think that through your writing and through I suppose writing and journalism, that's perhaps a way that architects have of diversifying their practice and view of the world, and to somehow grapple with their own fate and their own standing in the future. And I think this book does that very well. It was published in English 2.5 years ago, almost 3 years.
It was published in English. A little under 2 years ago.
And hopefully will be published in Russian very soon. But it still, I think, raises some very current and very, questions that I think are relevant to the younger generations and to students of architecture, which is why I greatly recommend it as a read. And you are continuing writing, and I believe you're working on a book right now. Can you share a couple of secrets as to what that's about?
I'm working on a novel. The novel is called The Master Plan. It's about an architecture who gets the commission of a lifetime, all he could ever dream to. He designs the capital of a non-existent republic in Africa who hopes to acquire international recognition by building a capital. Because countries have capitals, and then the reason is when you have a capital, you're a country. The whole thing turns out to be an incredible sham, and rather than being the hero with a dream commission, he becomes the culprit, and he becomes the face of the sham, and he has to kind of draw a life lesson out of that. It's Sherman McCoy in Bonfire of the Vanities reinvented as an architect, essentially.
I can't wait. Okay, I think that must have inspired some questions. Thank you very much, Reinier. Should we ask the audience what they would like to contribute or ask? Does anyone have a question? Yep, over here. Second row.
Hello? Stand up. Okay. So thank you for the talk. You seem to be suggesting the potential social good that can come from the valuation of the reuse of materials, as you're suggesting. If we design for panels that can be reused, that can allow for this kind of second-hand market, which can be good in the end. But at the same time, it seems that design for the reuse of space in the contemporary world is often something that sort of has an anti-social objective, and that it allows for investment to flow more freely, things like that. So I'm wondering if you could comment more on this question of the valuation of reuse.
Yeah, I think there is a number of situations which are, in the context of the market economy, of the private economy, almost set in stone. First of all is that the ownership of a building and the ownership of the land upon which it stands are one and the same in most cases, which means that's also why you call it Niedwigimost or Immobilien in German, that which doesn't move, that which is unalterable, that which is stable, that which you will know is there in 100 years' time, and that's therefore something you can invest in. Once land would become like oxygen, or like air, or like water, an acknowledged public resource, you would deal with half the problem, in the sense that you would, the certainty which is the root cause of speculation, and think about that, that is a weird irony, would at least be reduced in half, which would allow the unfettered speculation with buildings to be curtailed, or it could be a means of intervention when things get out of hand. I think recyclability of buildings by definition makes then the building temporary. You acknowledge that buildings are temporary anyway, and we will benefit greatly from acknowledging that. I think those are two immediate things. And one is a change in laws. The other one is a change largely in a design mindset, where you can use sustainability, climate sustainability, actually to further a more an economic aim, a fair economy, and that's in fact the main extent to which I'm interested in sustainability and recyclability. Is not necessarily for climate purposes, but for the economic consequences it might have to curtail speculation. So that is two things. I mean, I have another. I have some other points in mind which could help, but when it comes to urbanism and architecture, those are the main things.
Hi, I'm Pablo from Mexico. So my question would be like, if this relation that you talk about, architecture and the market, if we imagine this transition from the market in terms of cycles of finances to get like faster revenues and stuff like that, how this transition for other kind of sectors where they can get like faster revenues could affect architecture. If we think maybe about the word, for example, simulation, how so many master plans never get built or done, but still there's transactions. Like it's more related to your.
No, that's very interesting. I would like to respond via an anecdote. In 2007, a year before the global financial crisis broke loose, our office worked in the Middle East. Worked quite a lot in the Middle East. We, in that year, had a record turnover as a business, which I think we still haven't surpassed. And 40% of that turnover, nearly half of that turnover, was from efforts that never materialized, mainly from master plans that never got built. It was perfect. Everything was front-loaded. Everything was in the early stages. By the time, doing a building and getting sued over malpractice, that stage never even got around because they were all happily axed before that. But that indicates an interesting thing about the state of architecture itself. We think architecture is real, everything else is virtual. A large part of architecture design in itself is virtual. The main purpose of these master plans was to create hype around the lands on which they were envisaged, to increase a value in land so that land could be sold at a higher price even when the land was no different than it was before the master plan. So it also indicates to what extent the stock market, the whole economy, is a matter of psychology, forms of advertisement, forms of hype. And a lot of these master plans, part of them got axed, I think, because of the financial crisis. I seriously suspect there were a fair few master plans which were commissioned even knowing that. But as an architect, you're generally the last person to know, and of course you learn from getting trapped in exactly those type of exercises.
There's a question over here.
Hello, thank you for this discussion and for the book. My question is rather...
Well, don't thank me just yet. Yeah, go on, sorry.
My question is rather practical, maybe. You told if you understand that you do something wrong, you shouldn't do it, yeah? So how are you in the company? If you are on the process and you have a contract, if your team understand that you're doing something wrong in your design, how you work in this situation? If you're one person who understands that the project goes in something not well,
Unethical.
I don't think that's what I said, but I understand the question. And I will answer it. I made a distinction between the ignorant fool and the knowledgeable pervert. And why I prefer the knowledgeable pervert is because with the knowledgeable pervert there is hope for improvement. Because he knows, and only when you know can you do something about it. When you don't know, you can never be an agent of change. The second part of the question is, when you are involved in efforts where you can see that in a way the badness begins to prevail. Yeah, what do you do? And this is one of the most complicated things of being an architect. And this is ultimately the theme of the book. Architects, by definition, get their hands dirty. Because just as there are no more good or bad countries, there are also no good or bad building efforts per se. Every project you are involved in is a neck-and-neck race between laudable intentions on the one hand, and rather less laudable intentions on the other. And it's a judgment call which one will prevail. There are no 100% good projects, no 100% bad projects. And you make that call the moment you accept a commission, and you make that call during a number of times while you're working at it. And very often the only moment you know is when you're beyond the point of no return. When you're before the point of no return, you have the liberty to abort. When you are beyond the point of no return, you write a book.
A great celebratory place to end. Reinier, thank you very much. We look forward to seeing the book in Russian.
Thank you.